Hi, my name is Stanley Crawford, and today I will be speaking to you about the misunderstanding between mental illness and violence. Looking around the room, I believe that many of you feel that the United States has had far too many cases of mass shootings within the last decades. Well, that is because you're right. According to a study conducted by Vox, since 2013, the United States has experienced 2,411 instances of mass shootings. To put that in perspective, that equates to roughly one per day. In addition to this, the Giffords Law Center in Preventing Gun Violence reports that in the last 4 years, gun violence has risen by 30% in our country. Now, many Americans have differing views as to why this increase is occurring. Some feel that our society has an overall too ease of access in purchasing guns, while others feel that the mentally ill are left unsupervised and are free to commit these atrocities. Unfortunately, many do believe the latter. That is because, according to a 2017 CBS poll, 68% of Americans believe that better mental health screening will lead to a reduction in gun violence. In addition to this, a Gallup poll has reported that 80% of Americans blame the mental health system for our country's increase in gun violence. Unfortunately, the data of the violence in our country does not support this and does not show a direct link between diagnosed illness and violent tendencies. Now, these viewpoints of the way mental illness is connected with violence in our country is nothing new. In fact, it has actually been around since the 1960s with the Gun Control Act of 1968. That act was implemented in order to create a system where those diagnosed with mental illness were flagged down and were unable to purchase guns if they so attempted to. Now, these amendments to these acts have occurred all the way up until 2013 with the Obama administration's Fixed Gun Checks Act of 2013. That act further tightened the restrictions on those with mental illness by allowing the ATF to add more people into the databases that would keep them from purchasing firearms. Now, the politicians in our country and the legislation such as this that they have implemented does not contribute to allowing us as Americans to understand that mental illness and violence do not correlate. Politicians, Republican and Democratic, have vouched their support for these red flag programs. Politicians such as Republican Roy Blunt and Democrat Mark Kelly. Perhaps the worst sort of statement that has been produced by our politicians is that of President Trump, who in a recent interview with ABC News stated that he believed that mental hospitals should be reinstituted, sort of asylums, in order to contain those with mental illness. Now, it's not only our politicians that have contributed to this sentiment. The news media is consistently notorious for causing us to think these things about those with mental illness. In fact, a BBC quoted headline following the mass shooting at the Country Music Festival in Las Vegas stated that, in quote, investigators have suggested the shooter had a history of mental illness, end quote. Now, in order to analyze the number of news reporting stations that have actually broadcasted this sort of information to our society, it's noted that 56% of national news stories that have discussed mental illness have attributed it to violence. Out of that 56%, 75% of those stories were correlated with a specific instance of a mass shooting. That is according to the Development and Implementation of Recommendations for Responsible Media Coverage of Mass Shootings. Unfortunately, all of these external sources have contributed to this sentiment throughout our country. However, the facts of violence in our country simply do not support a correlation to mental illness. To show this, 5% of 120,000 gun homicides between 2001 and 2010 were perpetrated by someone with mental illness. In addition to this, and according to the American Journal of Public Health, those with a mental disability are actually 10 times more likely to be a victim than to perpetrate it. In addition, many people may feel that those with a mental illness, and who may also be dangerous, are never screened. However, prior to the shooting at the Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, the state of Florida's Baker Act had screened 195,000 Florida residents in the year prior, yet only concluded that 2% of them were a legitimate threat to society. Now, this entire notion in our society that those with a mental illness or decreasing mental health are inherently dangerous has had horribly negative effects on the mentally ill community. It has caused those with a mental illness to be much less likely to seek the help that they need, as well as talk to others about their situation for fear of being labeled as dangerous. This is perfectly illustrated by Duke psychiatry professor Martin Schwartz, who states that, and quote, his comments are really stigmatizing when referring to President Trump. And I think it makes it hard for people to accept that they have a mental illness if they're going to be lumped in with what Trump calls deranged killers. Now, if we can accept that mental illness is not the root cause for all this violence, then it's important to look at all the other factors that are actually contributed to it. In recent studies by our medical professionals, it is noted in the American Journal of Public Health that it is actually a combination of external stimuli to an individual that have contributed to their capability to commit gun violence. External situations such as their past experiences, trauma, or even the media that they're exposed to. Ultimately, we as students and the young people of our country, it is up to us to alter the status quo that mental illness is the sole factor in gun violence, because of the horribly negative effects it has had on thousands of people struggling with their mental health. Overall, in order to better unisolate those individuals, we as a community have to change this notion that those with mental illness are dangerous. Thank you.